we're going to focus on creating dimensions and creating cubes using those data source views. So I have an empty SSA solution right now in front of me. So I'm going to quickly go ahead and just to review the steps. I'm going to quickly go ahead and create our data sources and data source views once again. So just to review the steps also for everyone. So remember this thing, the impersonation information. We'll discuss about this concept more in a little more detail in a while. So for the time being, we are using the default service account. Next, finish. That's our data source. We understand data source is just a connection provider. It's just like a connection to the database. But to actually get the tables and to actually be more specific about what all tables and views you want to be part from that database, you need to create a data source view. So we discussed about this in detail, and we'll click on new data source view. Obviously, a data source view will use a data source at an underlying layer. And here now I can go back and choose what all tables I want to be selected from the data source views. I can choose my fact net sales, and then I can select all the related tables of the DSV. Okay, that's the reason. I'll go back and remove that. That's internet sales. Sorry, that's reason again. So let me go back and choose internet sales. Back up, and you can see that's internet sales DBO. I'll add all the related tables. I'll go back and remove the internet sales reason from here, and let's keep the other tables. Click on next. Click on finish, and that's our DSV. You can see all the tables that are added to my DSV right now. Click on finish, and we are good to go. So that is our DSV. As a next step, you can see this is the structure of our DSV. At the center, you have the fact table, and all around it, you have all the dimension tables, right? And as the next step, we are going to talk about how to create a dimension from this. Okay, now please understand there are two kinds of dimensions. Now, obviously, when I talk about dimensions, and the moment I mention we have to create a dimension, most of you here will be wondering, okay, why do I need to create a dimension again? Did we not create a dimension in the data warehouse? And you're absolutely correct on that count. You're absolutely correct that, okay, this is a dimension, this is a dim date, it's a dimension, it's a dim promotion, this is a dimension. However, that dimension is what we call a database level dimension. It is not a cube dimension. So although you have designed it as a dimension table, although you have designed it as a dimension table, although you have modeled your data warehouse in such a way that you understand it's a dimension table, however, it is not a dimension yet at the cube level. So you need to tell the cube, you need to tell the cube that it is a dimension at the cube level, and that is why you have the concept of cube dimensions. Okay, so this is what this dimension stands for, cube dimensions. Just to repeat again, this is what we have called the database dimensions, because although you have defined it as dim date, although you have defined it as dim customer, there is no way to tell the cube it is a dimension. Right? Just looking at the DSV, just if you look at the source data, I mean, obviously, if as a database architect, you can go back, you can analyze your dimension table, and just by looking at the table, you will understand, okay, it's a dimension table. But SSAS is not intelligent enough, right? For SSAS to understand, for SQL Server Analysis Services to understand, okay, it is a cube dimension. So when I build my cube, I'm going to use it as a dimension. For SSAS to understand that, you have to explicitly specify it's a dimension, and that is something you do in this wizard. So you specify all the dimensions here, and finally you build a cube using your facts and dimensions, right? So as the first step, we'll go ahead and create our dimensions. So a simple way to create dimensions is just right click on it, click on new dimension. And as we have spoken before, we understand that whatever you perform, whether it is, be it you're creating a cube, be it you're creating a dimension, whatever steps you're performing, you have to use your data source view as the intermediate of literally everything that you're performing. So new dimension, click on next, and that's one of the reasons why I mentioned that data source view is so important. It's so important to design a proper data source view, because if your data source view is not correct, then whatever you do downstream, be it you're creating a cube or be it you're creating a dimension, all of that will go for a toss. All right, so how would you like to create a dimension? There are a few options here. We'll typically go ahead and select use an existing table, because it is understood that, and where are those tables existing? When it says it is not going to pick up those tables from your underlying source. What is the underlying source for your dimensions? Just as I mentioned, the underlying source for your dimensions is your DSV. So it is go back to your DSV and it will pick your existing tables from your DSV. Click on next, and you can see the tables are listed out. So this is your data source view. You can select your data source view from where to choose the dimensions. You can choose your main tables. You can see there are total 7 tables in my DSV right now, and that is how you can choose your dimensions. So obviously fact is not a dimension. I'll go back and choose my dimension. Dim customer is a dimension. It'll ask you to choose the key column and the name column. I'll talk more about this in detail in a while, what the key column and name column means. Key column is nothing but your primary key column, but name column is basically also similar to your key column, but name column is how you display it. I'll talk more about it in a while, but key column, just remember, is your primary key column. So it'll by default identify it. And unless otherwise specified, your name column is the same as your key column. You can see key column, it's a primary key by default, but your name column is by default your key column unless otherwise you change it. Okay, and I'll give you some more clarity with examples on this in a while. So this is my first dimension that I'm creating. Click on next, and here you have to select. So this is your key column, which is selected by default, right? That's the key column selected by default, and you can additionally select other attributes as well. So you can choose your first name, you can choose your middle name, and you can choose your last name. You can see select dimension attributes. Make sense? Simple enough. And maybe you want to select your gender. So click on next, and you can take a look at your dimension, how your dimension looks right now. So that's your dim customer. That's the name of your dimension. Or maybe you just want to call it dim. You just want to call it customer. It's a customer dimension. You can rename it at every step. And you can see your customer dimension consists of 5 attributes. And attributes are nothing but fields. It's just like fields of a table, columns of a table. So it's like attributes of a dimension. This is a terminology. In data warehousing terms, they're called attributes of a dimension, right? And customer key is the primary key. That's your key column, and all the others are the additional attributes of that particular dimension. Click on finish, and here you have your very first dimension. And the moment you look at this, you'll see a different kind of wizard opens up. So all this while we were in the data source view wizard, it is still there in the tab. It's a different tab opens up. You can still navigate. You can still toggle over in each of the windows, but you can see both these tabs are coexisting parallelly on top. So that's your customer.dim, and this is your design interface for dimensions. You can see that's your customer dimension you have selected, and these are all the 5 attributes that are listed out. And towards the right, you will see what is the underlying data source view from where you have fetched those attributes. So where you have fetched that dimension. So the underlying data source view is my dim customer table from my DSV, and this is my dimension. It's the cube dimension that I've created. So whatever you're creating here are basically my my database level dimensions, right? Make sense? So I just wanted to again revisit this concept. So be very, very clear about what we are trying to talk about here. Just wanted to again get things sorted out in terms of what is a cube dimension and what is a database dimension. So just to repeat the concept all over again, and just to take you back to the DSV real quick. So you can see these are all tables that I fetched from my underlying source, right? My underlying source is AdventureWorks Data Warehouse 2014. AdventureWorks DW 2014 is my data warehouse, right? That's just like a database. This is my source, right? My source could be literally anything. Okay, but it turns out it's a SQL Server source here. So this is how I'm representing my tables from my DSV. This is the tables I'm choosing. Now it turns out that I've already modeled my data warehouse. It turns out that I've already properly structured everything in my data warehouse. Hence, there are no worries as such, right? So everything's perfect. Everything's looking good. However, imagine a scenario. Okay, so it's just like saying it's a dim customer and it is a dimension, right? It is a dimension, but it is a dimension. You model it as a dimension from the database perspective, but when you bring that into the data source view, SSAS does not know whether it is a dimension. SSAS has no way of differentiating this, whether it is a fact, it's a dimension, or whether it's any other normal table. And you have to explicitly go back and tell SSAS whether it is a dimension or not. And that is something you do in this wizard. You go back and choose your database dimensions. Okay. Again, these are your database dimensions. So whatever I'm doing here, the customer dimension with 5 attributes in it. So I am explicitly telling SSAS that, hey, I imported this DSV. In my DSV, I had a dim customer table. And from that dim customer table, I'm creating a dimension. And this is a dimension. This is specifically a dimension I want to create. So this is a database dimension. When you go to the cube, and I haven't talked about cubes yet, inside the cube, using those database dimensions, you will create what we call a cube dimensions, right? So just to take you step by step again, first you have the source. Using the source, you get your DSV, and using your DSV, obviously, you create your dimensions. You explicitly specify, you explicitly tell SSAS what your dimensions are, and we call that as database dimensions. So whatever we define here, these are all database dimensions. I can create one more dimension table here similarly. Let's say, let's time I want to create for, let me go back and choose dim product. Click on next, let's choose a default English product name, and let's go ahead and choose color. And here you can see I'm again creating, and I'll just call it product. I'll just call this product. And you can see again I'm creating a a new database dimension. So I'm explicitly telling SSAS that, hey, these are my two dimension tables. All right. Now, these are database dimensions. When we go to Cube, we will see how you're going to use the dimension tables, how you're going to use the database dimensions that I've defined here, .dim, and how I'm going to use these to create what we call as cube dimensions, right? So that is how the basic hierarchy works here in SSAS, right? But otherwise, you can see it's pretty straightforward. Even in products, you can see those are the three attributes I've selected. There's a small key column, key icon listed beside product key, which means it is a key column as dim product, and you can see this is the data source view that I've chosen, right? There are a lot of options that are around it, and again, there are a lot of things you can talk about in terms of different options that you have, and obviously you can go ahead and you can delete a particular attribute from here, and you can additionally add in new attributes from here. So even after you exit a dimension wizard, if you decide that you have to add some new attributes, so no worries. Let's say you want to add standard cost, just drag and drop it, and you can see it got added. Let's say you want to add finished goods flag, and you just drag and drop it, click on it, drag and drop it, and you can see that you were able to add it, because the underlying concept remains the same, that at the end of the day, your data source view is your source for your dimension, database dimension. So you take all your columns from here. Additionally, you can go ahead and remove your attributes. You can right click on it and you can delete your attributes as well. Simple enough. It's pretty straightforward concepts overall. Couple of other things that you can perform here as part of your database dimension designing. You can obviously go back and rename tables. We saw we can add or remove new tables, and then you can go to attribute relationships. So this is an advanced feature we'll talk about. Translations we're going to talk about, but then there's something called browser, and here we slowly come to the concept of build, deploy, and process. What is the concept of build, deploy, and process? Very, very important, not only from the concept of cubes, but also from the concept of dimensions and cubes in general. So it's the same kind of process you follow for both. And essentially what you're doing here is, and let me just take a quick paint wizard and show you at a brief conceptual level what you're trying to accomplish here. Largely what you have here is your development environment. So I'm going to paint it as a laptop. So this is the place where you're developing your SSAS solution. So this is your laptop. Hope this resembles a personal laptop. It could be any other system. It could be a workstation, whatever it is. All right. So this is the place where you've opened up your Visual Studio, data tools, just the way we opened up here. And this is the place where you're designing your solution. Right now, what we are trying to achieve here is, generally, what we are trying to achieve here is, you're going to design your solution and you're going to build your solution. Right. So where is the build? So if you go back to your project, and you just check your dimension itself, so you have the option for building this, right? You can go back to your project and you can see, if you right click on it, you can build your project. Okay, so the idea is you're building your project. So in your development workstation, you can see build succeeded, right? We all understand from a programming background what build is, right? It's just like compilation. At a very high level, it means that a lot of things that happen behind the scenes internally. There's a lot of internal things that happens, but at a very high level, what it means is you are checking your code whether everything is correct, if all the syntaxes and other things match, so you're good, right? So build has succeeded. So this is something you perform in your development environment. So you're building your code here. I'll call this B, right? Once you build your code, what do you do? So here, what you're doing is we are developing our solution. Here I'm developing a dimension, but gradually we're going to go to a cube. So what we are essentially doing is we are building an SSAS solution, right? An SSAS solution to and ultimately we are creating a cube. So it's a solution, right? It's a solution. We all understand a .sln file. What a .sln file is, it's a solution file, right? That consists of multiple project files. So that's your solution file. And what we are basically doing here is we are trying to deploy this onto the server. So this is the deploy stage. After you build something in your development environment, you are going to deploy it onto the server. That's your deploy. That's your deploy. And your server is basically your SSAS server. So I'm going to call this my SQL Server Analysis Services server. So this is your server, right? That's your server. So I'm going to also show you, I'm going to open my own server. I'm going to show you how that looks like. So obviously in my case, the way I have set up SSAs, and probably if you have installed it in your personal system, it will be the same for you as well. So in all probability, this will be a local machine. It will be a local system, right? So you build a solution here, you compile your code, and you deploy the solution onto the server. So once that happens, the entire solution is deployed to the server. And once that happens, and one thing I want to talk about deploy is, when you deploy something, when you deploy your solution, you're only deploying the structure. So you build your code, and even before the step, you have your data source. So let's say you have a database here. So just to put all the pieces of the puzzle, let me call this my DB. This is my database. Okay, it's my SQL Server database, whatever database it is, right? So what you're doing as part of build is you're the developer. So if you remember here, what we did was we connected to our source, we connected to our data source, we connected to our data sources, sort of views, we pulled in some of the tables. We were able to see some basic data. So when you go to a data source view, and when you say explore data, you're able to retrieve some basic data, but that data is not really stored. Every time you're saying explore data, the data is actually fetched from your underlying source. You're not storing any data in your SSA solution. So the underlying concept that I'm trying to drive here is, you are designing your solution here. The entire schema is present in your SSA's design environment. The data resides in your database. That's the underlying concept I'm trying to drive. So you build your solution, you have all the schema, everything, and you deploy that solution as it is without data. You don't have any data at this stage. You're deploying your solution without any data onto the SSA server. That's your SQL Server Analysis Services server, right? And once you deploy the solution onto your server, what happens then? Can people use it? Let's say it's a cube that you're deploying. Can people use that cube? Can users start to query your cube? Answer is no. Users cannot query your cube at that moment. Why? The reason being, it doesn't have any data. So in order for users to use that cube, we perform the very final step, which is what we call a process. So as part of process, what happens is, whatever you have deployed onto your server, that is a cube that you have deployed onto your server, will directly query your database, and it will fetch your data. So this is what we call process. That is the final piece of the puzzle. It's the process stage. So hope the concepts are clear. That's your build. That is what you do in a development environment. You deploy your schema, your structure, and your entire solution, everything without the data onto the server, the SSAS server. And finally, you process that data in the server. So processing, when as part of processing, your server, whatever solution is there in the server, whatever cube is there in the server, or whatever dimensions are there in the server, they'll go back and query your underlying source, and they will bring that data into the server. And that is how the data comes into the cube. All right. So that's the build, deploy, and process concepts. So I wanted to touch upon this because what I'm going to show you here, and as I was discussing about the browser, if you go back to the dimension tab, click on my dimension tab, and you can see this is my product dimension. So I've defined a very simple dimension. There are 3 attributes in my product dimension. So all I want to do here is, I want to go ahead and browse my data. Okay, so if I click on my browser, the first thing you will find is it says it does not have access to the database, or it only says database does not exist. So this is an error you might also get, and the reason why this is happening is, when you try to browse something, you are essentially trying to query your data from your server. And try to understand this concept very, very carefully. How do we query data from a database? We query data from a database using what we call TSQL. So when your database is SQL Server, you use Transact SQL. When your database is DB2, you use some other version of SQL, MySQL. So it depends on the kind of SQL server, the kind of database you're using. The native dialect of SQL changes, right? So the query language changes depends on what you're querying. Make sense? So for a database, that is how it is. For a cube or an SSA solution that you're deploying onto the server, because ultimately when you deploy the cube onto the server, users will be querying it, right? Users will be querying it. We all understand what a cube stands for. It is used for faster performance, right? So we all have discussed those concepts, but ultimately a user has to query it. And we talked about MDX at time, right? So users query it using the MDX query language, right? The same way that you query a database, the same way we'll query a cube as well. And that is what the browser stands for. Browser is more of a development environment view. Just like you are a developer, and you want to get a view of what the user will see when that user performs that same query from the server. So please understand, this is just like a preview kind of interface where you have not deployed the solution yet, but you want to get clarity what the user will see when they query the same cube in their server, right? So we haven't deployed it yet, and that is very evident here, and you can understand. And let me quickly open up my SQL Server Management Studio and show you some of the stuff where I'm deploying my cube. In my case, it will be my local system, hence I can directly show you some of the cubes I've deployed from here and how things look like in this context, right? Okay, I've just logged in for my database. I'm going to go back and connect to my analysis services. The server type should be analysis services. So it's looking good now. Connect. And you can see it's connecting. In Object Explorer now you'll be able to spot my cubes, the cube projects. Here's the demo cube projects I created for you. And here you can see databases. These are all multi-dimensional databases. And here you can see the multi-dimensional projects. Okay, I'm going to show you some of this stuff again later on, how things are, and how we can work on it. But just to explain to you the concept where this stuff is actually stored. So you can actually go, you can open up your cubes and you can actually start querying. You can browse your cubes from here. You can browse your cubes, and here you will find an interface like this. See, it's just opening up. Let me show you how that looks like. And this is the kind of interface you will get. So now you can go back and drag and drop items. Drag and drop your measures. Let's say it's internet sales. You want to look at internet sales based on certain products. You can go back and drag and drop, and the query language that is used behind the scenes. And as I was mentioning, so what we are performing here is, so please understand, I've opened up my server right now. So I've opened up my SSAS server, right? And now I'm querying a cube using what I call an MDX query. So that's exactly what I'm doing. So although you can see it's drag and drop, but at the underlying layer, I'm still writing a query. If you just go to the design mode, click on this once, you will see the underlying MDX query that is written. It's the same concept where whenever you are trying to build some charts and graphs using Excel against a SQL Server database, although you're just dragging and dropping columns, you think of a pivot table where you're trying to create a pivot table using some an underlying database. All you're doing is just dragging and dropping the respective fields onto the categories or the legends or the series, and you're getting the graphs, but at the underlying layer you're still writing a query, and that is not visible. So here you can see the underlying query that is being written. Click on this back and you go to the design mode, right? So this is a browser. This is what the user is going to see, and it's very similar to your browser. And you can some dimensions also, and the same thing you can look at for dimensions as well. Come here and you can just right click on this and you can say browse, and you can browse your dimensions the exact same way. Okay, you can see each of the individual members of the dimension. Make sense? That's about how to browse a dimension. And if you come back to your solution here, and the same thing I want to explain to you here. But for doing that, we understood the steps what we have to perform. We have to build, deploy, and process. So either you can do it directly from here, right click and click on build, click on deploy, click on process. You can go to 3 steps parallelly, or you can directly click on the process from here. So what it means is it is going to directly process, and whenever you try to process it, it says that the server content appears out of date. So here it is not exactly out of date, it is not deployed. So you can see multidimensional project 5. And if you go back to your server, you will see that there is nothing called multidimensional project 5. So I don't have multidimensional project 5 here. So it is a new entry, it is a new database that is going to be created. So when I go back and deploy it, so it first asks me, do you want to deploy it? I want to say yes. I want to build it first, then I want to deploy it. It is deploying and it is processing. You can see deployment completed successfully. Now if you go back and right click on this, you should be able to see that multidimensional project 5 has been created here. So the deployment has been completed, and now the stuff has been pushed onto the server. And now what I can do is I can process my data. But please note, again, let me highlight to you, if you don't process it, you can still query your data, but then you will see empty rows. You won't see anything visible there, right? So here in this case, you can see this is your dimension. That's your dimension, that's your customer dimension. But you cannot query it. You cannot query it because you can see that ensures the dimension has been processed. So you have deployed the structure. SSAS, you have built a solution, you've deployed the structure, you've deployed the schema, of the solution, but you have not processed it, hence it doesn't have any data. Hence, when you try to browse it, when the customer tries to see it in the server, it cannot do so because it doesn't have any data. So you have to go back and process it. So process full is the default option. Click on run. It will process this data, process that dimension, so to say, and you can see that if process succeeded. And as part of process succeeded, what happens is if you just expand it, you will see the details on exactly how many rows are inserted and stuff like that. You can also see the underlying SQL queries that are inserted here. Click on close, and that's it. So that's done now. And what you can go is go back, refresh it, and try to browse it again. And you should be able to see that it is, you're not now able to browse that cube. You're able to browse that specific dimension right now. So you can just go back, and now you can see that I'm able to browse my product. Okay, so obviously you can browse your dimension. So whenever you select a dimension, you can select the corresponding attributes. So attributes, you can remember that product dimension are 3 attributes, or at least I chose those 3 attributes: English product name, product key, and finally color. These are the 3 attributes I chosen. Okay, this is at a server level. At your SSA solution level for a developer, you can go to your browser and you can check the same thing here as well. Okay, the same thing you can check here as well. So you can see it says out of date. So just try loading the browser again. Let me go back and click on this just to refresh it. So what happens is sometimes the changes are not processed. So just click on reload. You can either click on that, or you can click on a small little icon here called reconnect. Reconnect is a way for you to just reconnect the thing to your database again. Just kind of a refresh, you can say. Okay, so whenever the changes are not updated, so you can just click on reconnect, and now you can see that dim product. I'm indeed able to see data the same way I was able to see in the server. So this is more at the development environment level. So you can check what all stuff is updated in your dev environment. As a developer, let's say you perform some changes and you immediately want to see the result of those changes. It's very easy to come here and check that. Okay, so that is what you perform at your browser. Make sense? And this is a very simple demonstration of how you can create dimensions. All right, so that's about dimensions. Thank you.